author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Christmas season is here, and with it a time to reflect on the year just gone by. Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're going to find out what were the big stories, the big issues, and the big surprises that rocked 2024 and cast an eye to the future. Remember, Liberty Nation Radio is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donner. Lisa, looking forward to Christmas?
Hi, Mark. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas indeed. It's great to have you on, and I do appreciate it. Now, this time of year, I think the most important thing to do, especially as we are coming up to Christmas Day, is to look back and reflect. And I'd like to do that, but on the political and cultural level with you today, Lisa. So let's start off with a nice, easy question for you. What's the most memorable aspect of 2024?
Well, I call this the year of the rise of the Sons of Liberty. Sorry. Oops. I know you're broadcasting from the UK, but Americans really made themselves known. They pushed back against a number of leftist narratives. And when you look back at the American Revolution, the overwhelming force didn't make Americans shrink. It inspired them. And I think the American people were inspired this year to make their voice heard.
Yeah, it seems that there was a growing current of inspiration under the, what's the best way to say this? Bubbling underneath the surface of the Overton window, bubbling to either side of the Overton window, I think is the more accurate way to say it because of the shift that we've seen. But I think part of that may have come from a vacuum in leadership. Now, we've obviously seen since Donald Trump won the election, Joe Biden's really taken a back seat to everything. But for those of us who have been following the White House for the last year, we've seen Joe Biden essentially already checked out for a long, long time in terms of his cognitive ability, in terms of his energy, in terms of his willingness to actually fight for something beyond whatever happens to be the meal du jour in Congress. And so people were actually kind of desperate for a bit of leadership, or at least a figurehead, so they could bring themselves forward. And that's why I think they voted for Donald Trump in such numbers.
Well, this is the lamest lame duck I've seen in a long time, maybe since the years of Jimmy Carter, and that shows you how far I go back. But Mark, you have to consider that this was a most unusual year in American politics. It really was. I mean, we had 2 assassination attempts. We had a last-minute major party candidate turnover, which has really never happened before. The pardon of a president's son, which is kind of unusual. Just loads of crazy stuff, But the American people decided to make known what they wanted. They were not buying the leftist narrative. And I think we're seeing the decline of the leftist narrative in a number of areas. Let's start with lawfare.
Yeah, lawfare is a big one. It's really the first time. And I'm not going to use those hated, dreaded words, unprecedented.
No, this isn't an unprecedented free zone, right?
Yeah, we do know.
Because practically nothing is unprecedented.
Absolutely. I mean, I reserve the right to use it if aliens come down and land on the White House lawn. But other than that, we do stay away from the term unprecedented. But it was really becoming apparent that the forces of the left, whether that's the political forces or the legal forces, were out to get Donald Trump. Now, how do we know they were out to get Trump? Well, they said they were on the campaign trail. And to charge him and find him guilty of things that have never before been a crime, where the alleged victims of the crimes, we would want to enter, and these being the banks, we would want to enter the same business arrangements again. That was the civil one in New York. But I think it just laid bare that there's a vindictive streak in American politics, and it was coming from the political left. And because of that, they were roundly rejected.
Well, there were 91 indictments.
Mm.
And I think when America and the American people woke up is when all the FBI and et cetera, surrounded Mar-a-Lago and went in there and rummaged through Mrs. Trump's drawers and everything in between. I think that just went over the top, and the sensibilities of the American people were that this was not appropriate, no matter who or how much you dislike someone. It was an inappropriate use of force. And those 91 indictments, even, though some juries came back with a guilty verdict, the American people just were not buying it.
Mm. Yeah, it really put a lie to the idea of just, there's only one justice, and it's the same justice across the board. Because we've seen that injustices are not punished. We've seen that so much this last year. And I think an interesting case in point is the recent Daniel Penny acquittal. Now, there's a lot of legal experts speaking publicly saying that shouldn't have been, he shouldn't have even been prosecuted for that, because there was actually, we had Mehdi Hassan, I think it was, who is a prominent contributor on MSNBC, or was. And he was saying, imagine if Jordan Neely had been white, and what kind of reaction would we have had? And the fact actually is, for anybody who can do more than a minute's research before forming an opinion, is that there was in New York a very, very similar situation just a short time before the Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely one, where there was an aggressive, I believe it was a white man, on the subway, and he got stabbed by a black Good Samaritan trying to protect people. And he wasn't charged, didn't spend a day in jail. And so people can see that there is a very politically motivated lawfare system in place that favors the current narrative, the current progressive narrative of victims and oppressors.
Yeah, and Americans don't like that. I mean,
no, nobody likes that, right?
The more the British taxed them, the more they said enough, and they were willing to risk everything they had. And I think there were a lot of Americans before the election that were just kind of keeping quiet. I wrote a story that, there weren't that many lawn signs this year in some parts of the nation. And people just weren't letting it known who they were going to vote for. But then when it was voting day, when it was time to count the returns, they were quite clear. It was an undisputable win for Donald Trump. It was not a landslide, but it was certainly clear and convincing. And ever since then, I think the American people have said enough with, especially like you were just talking about the Daniel Penny case. The race hustlers came out the next day and started screaming for this, that, and the other and threatening. I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
No, I suspect that the progressive orthodoxy might be on its last legs, and that, more than anything, is something I'm grateful for this Christmas season, Lisa.
Well, the political winds were certainly blowing Donald Trump's way. I mean, look at those 2 assassination attempts. Wow.
Yeah, it is funny, though, that they were kind of disappeared from the pages of the media so quickly, when it's something, I mean, this is a former president, potential next president at the time. And what did we see? We saw doubts. Was he hit by a chip from the teleprompter?
Oh, right.
Things like this. And I mean, it was fairly disgusting behavior, because they disliked the man. They're willing to sacrifice not just the truth, but any respectability that they may have once had. And we've seen that again more recently with the shooting of the healthcare CEO.
But again, Mark, you have to say Americans weren't buying it. They just weren't buying this phony teleprompter thing. They saw the ear, and anybody who would do that, raise their fist in the air after being shot, coming within a quarter of an inch of being completely annihilated. I think it really inspired a lot of Americans. Now, some on the left, were constantly pushing against him, but I think people were paying attention to their pocketbooks, not what they were saying about inflation. Oh, inflation is getting better. Well, then they go to the grocery store and they're thinking to themselves, yeah, like for who?
It's amazing the how little the legacy media talked about how just because inflation's coming down now, it doesn't mean that all the cumulative inflation is not still there. It just means that things are getting more expensive less quickly. Anyway, that's my bugbear for the whole year is the lack of information about inflation. We're going to be back with Lisa K. Donna after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Lisa K. Dunn, Liberty Nation's executive editor. Now, Lisa, let's talk about this year just gone and the death of PC culture, because I think those bells are tolling. What say you?
Well, I think the bells are tolling. I was just thinking about Notre Dame's bells starting to toll again after being refurbished. But, it seems to me like it may be premature to say it's dead, but it's dying for sure. So I think, Mark, Americans have just had enough of this PC culture. I mean, the stores are backing off from all this DEI stuff. And I think, it goes back to actually the taxpayer. They're tired of funding this stuff. And the Doge that's coming up with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, I think, has government people sort of shaking in their boots.
I actually suspect that it goes even deeper than that. And I'd like to put some of the credit to Professor Jordan B. Peterson, who has really been speaking out on this kind of thing. And the point that he makes is that if you're not saying what you feel you should say, if you're not speaking your words, whose words are you speaking? And for me, that really cuts to the heart of it, is when we talk about politically correct language and politically correct culture, where we're saying things that are not our own words, and we know they're not our own words, because if you say the even slightly wrong word, or the slight variation, I know there was a recent furor about person of color versus colored person, and people had to go out and apologize profusely for it. And when you have this kind of thing, you're not saying your words, you're saying specifically prescribed words. So you're not speaking for yourself, which is strange when every other person seems to be saying, well, I'm living my truth. Well, you're not, are you? You're living somebody else's truth. You're living the state-prescribed truth. And I think that is really at the heart of this blowback against what is essentially a coercive, controlling indoctrination of the mind from almost from birth. Because if people don't hear truth spoken from when they're born, how are they going to know to speak truth when they're adults?
Well, that's well said. And I think, too, it goes against American sense of fairness. I think so much of what's happened in this last year goes against American sense of fairness. I think 91 indictments went against their sense of fairness. I think having to march in lockstep to what everybody else is doing on college campuses goes against their sense of fairness. I think even the Secret Service not covering the land that they're supposed to land, including the high ground, goes against their sense of, if not fairness, their ability to do things properly. And so the government is kind of, and the media is taking a hit this year too. Sure.
Very much. We've seen MSNBC is about to be, and I wasn't familiar with this term, but spun off from
right.
from NBC, and it can't come a moment too soon. I mean, NBC's done a lot, and it really does have a great reputation, but it is tarnished by the sheer lunacy that comes out of the mouths of the folks over at MSNBC.
Well, and then CBS takes an interview and cuts it up, and they lose their credibility, And so now what they're looking at is changing the culture in the White House press briefing room, the James S. Brady press briefing room, and this has really got them.
Tell our listeners these details, because this is fascinating. Lisa has a great article on the pages of libertynation.com, sponsor of this here show. But please give us the brief outline so we can encourage everybody to go and read that.
Okay, so apparently Don Jr., the son of Donald Trump, was on a podcast. I think it may have been his own podcast, and he said, maybe it's time to open up the press briefing room to other people. Well, the press briefing room has always been a very elite, cloistered, close-knit group, and they work in tandem with the Senate House Committee too. So, a number of years ago when we started LN, I looked into, becoming a member you have to become a member of the White House Correspondents Association. And so your outlet has to meet certain criteria, and your people it's like getting into the worst kind of country club in the nation, and it's kind of a country club, but switching that up and allowing podcasters like Joe Rogan and Megyn Kelly and, that would really shake up the White House press room, because everything is in pecking order. They have assigned seats, where everybody's allowed to sit.
Here's the rows. This is for the top tier. This is for... But yeah, it's it really, as you say, it's a country club. Perhaps one with Bill Murray as the groundskeeper. But the idea that there might be people who actually have the pulse of the nation, I think this was demonstrated vividly during the last election. It's the podcasters. It's the people who are having the conversations that people want to hear, because their shows, they vastly outnumber the listenership, or the viewership even on some of them, of the regular shows on the old networks, the legacy networks. And there's a reason for that. It's because people want to hear what their take is. They want to hear the answers to the questions that they're asking. They don't want to hear, and I don't include Peter Ducey in this, by the way, because he has provided me with hours of entertainment. But they don't want to hear somebody ask a question that nobody wants the answer to, and then have an answer that is read verbatim from the file by Karine Jean-Pierre, and then we're no wiser for it. And I think that's the key point, isn't it? We don't become wiser when you have people who aren't interested in getting at the truth, getting answers from people who aren't interested in giving the truth. And so we're no wiser for watching the press briefings. I mean, some of us may feel a lot stupider for having listened to these White House press briefings. But if you get people, as you say, like podcasters in there, people who have made a living and made a career and carved out a niche themselves by asking questions that people want to know the answer to. I mean, that's a sea change.
You expect the White House press secretary to come up with spin. I mean, you expect that. That's their job. And that's been done for decades. But you're right. You should have the ability to at least ask pointed, difficult questions. And it's not just the legacy broadcast media. The legacy print media, the corporate print media, is really suffering too. And what's been happening, as Joe Schaefer would tell you, is they're starting to become on the take. They're taking lots of money from liberal entities and progressive entities, and that's a problem in the news media.
We are going to talk about that news media after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're very fortunate to continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donna. Thanks for sticking around, Lisa.
Good to be here, Mark.
So we kind of set ourselves up now to talk about the media in general and what kind of a year it's had. And I think this may have been, in my short living memory, I would say this has been the worst year for the media. What's your take?
Yeah, it's a year that's breaking the camel's back. I mean, print media is losing tons of money. And it was very interesting during the looking in review of the year, which is what we're doing here, when Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, decided not to endorse anyone for the first time in decades. That spoke volumes. And he got roasted from the readers of Washington Post.
Yeah, I know you and I we were glued to the comment section on Washington Post for that.
Actually, my husband was. He was.
I was too. I was thoroughly enjoying the overall meltdown. But it does go to show what places these outlets have been providing for their audience, doesn't it? The fact that they lost, I think it's like they lost a couple of 100,000 subscribers or more because of the decision not to endorse any candidate, let alone just not endorse Kamala Harris. And the readerships, they canceled their subscriptions, at least a couple of 100,000. And they did it because in their minds, Washington Post was not defending or bolstering their side of the argument, which kind of makes you wonder, what was Washington Post selling to its audience? Because they certainly weren't selling
not just the Washington Post. I don't want to.
Of course.
I don't want to pick on the Post because I think there's plenty of other, guilty parties in this party game. And it's across the nation, and these people are having to downsize their newsrooms, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look, just in the last 8 years, the nation has a lot more competition than we used to in the alternative media. I mean, there's just a lot of different places, and Americans are increasingly not going to those standard places to get their news. And that is the problem when you're trying to make money.
Yeah, so I think it's the difference between presenting and hoping that people pick up what you're putting out, or adopting something to appeal to a specific audience. So you have, as I say, you've got the New York Times on one side, and you've got on the other side, you've got places like Breitbart. And each one is considered either far left or far right, depending on which one you're looking at. But each of them caters to their audience. And to keep the coffers full, they have to. But when they try and sell themselves as this bastion of free thought and truth and unbiased analysis, well, that's simply not a tenable situation. Like we discussed MSNBC earlier in the show, and one thing really struck out to me on the election night coverage of MSNBC, which I was glued to. I thought it was a fascinating meltdown. Again, as it was in 2016. But you had, towards the end of the night, all the hosts were saying, we're losing. We've lost this. We have lost. We. And I knew that they were obviously in support of Kamala Harris there, but I found it jaw-dropping that they would be so open to just say, we, because what they're telling you is, if you are following us, you are only going to get one side of the story. And I think that's been proven.
Okay, but I think one thing that's blown under the radar that maybe we haven't talked about yet, that we should talk about, a turning point for the media was when Elon Musk bought Twitter. That was a watershed moment, because the people on the right had been saying for a long time we're being persecuted. And then through the Twitter files, we found out that what they were saying is true.
Yeah.
And the government spent a lot of money trying to hush up those on the right, including people who were against the standard talking points of COVID-19. And
267 million under the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I think what the American people said this year was, no, I reject lawfare. No, I reject PC culture. No, I reject you're telling me that the economy is getting better. And no, I reject this business of, canceling and controlling and shadow banning, people on the right.
Yeah, it's not an equitable system by any sense, which is strange considering it's pushed by people who say, equality, equity, all that. There's a huge difference between the two. But Elon Musk buying Twitter, that really was a watershed moment, and possibly it was the very one that pushed the legacy media over the edge of the cliff, as it were, because X is now, I believe it's the number one news app in almost like 100 countries. And of course, people don't, especially the younger generations who are going to be far more influential over the next decade, they don't get their news from CNN, for example. Unless of course they're stuck in an airport lounge and there's no Wi-Fi, which is or a doctor's surgery somewhere. They're not watching CNN to get their news. They're going where they can get a full range of opinions. And all the people who've left, or I don't know if these people have actually left. I think they're taking a hiatus while they flirt with, is it Blue Sky? Is the
right. Blue
app?
Sky is the new progressive app, right?
But the fact is that if they want to understand America, which, let's be fair, a lot of people on the left did fail to do. They failed to understand America, the media especially. They failed to understand what's happening in America. And that's why November the 6th was a surprise. That's why it was such a surprising morning for them to wake up and see that Donald Trump had won all of the swing states. But it's because they're not relying on places like X, because X is quite literally 50-50 in terms of left and right. And it's the real town square. That's where it is. It's the only place where you can speak to somebody from Texas and California in the same conversation as maybe somebody from another country at the same time. You can put information out there and you can learn things. And if it's wrong, you can push back in real time. And that's a beautiful...
It also fits within the mindset. It's shorter, it's briefer, it's faster, it's, holds the attention for as long as you want to hold your attention. But I did want to touch on one other topic before we left this year in review. And that is, I think Americans started saying no to getting involved in foreign wars. And I think that increasingly the world has become more of a powder keg. They don't want to be involved in it. They don't want to give their money to it. They'd rather get a better set of train tracks and a better train and less potholes than, spending it on infrastructure, than spending it on Ukraine. And I do understand there are international things to concern us, but I think Americans are just really tired of it.
Yes, the United States of America, now the anti-war country, say it ain't so. Let's discuss this when we come back after this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing to be joined by Liberty Nation's executive editor, Lisa K. Donner. Lisa, I thank you for sticking it out with me in this year-end show. I do appreciate you being here. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the international situation of the last year. Now, there's three things that really spring to mind for me, and that is the Ukraine war has entered, or is about to enter, is around the 3-year period, and still ongoing. There's the ongoing conflict in Israel that's been going on for over a year now. And of course, there's Syria that has so recently decided to become a whole new can of worms. And nothing seems to be peaceful around the world. And I wonder if, as we're approaching Christmas, like, what can we really hope for? What's a thing worth praying for with these? Because I don't think there's an easy solution to any of them.
Let me tell you, from an American's perspective, this all makes Americans very anxious. And the reason is because we are the ones that bail everybody out. Mm. And we're tired of it. And, putting not just the money, but the manpower. Donald Trump is right. People are tired of Americans dying in useless foreign wars. And, one of the things that he's done since he's been elected is starting to meet with world leaders. And I think he makes people like Putin nervous. Mm. I think Putin considers him a wild card, maybe even a little bit crazy. And maybe Donald Trump fosters that, just to keep Putin on edge.
Well, there's the idea of strategic ambiguity, which under the Biden administration with Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and these, we know exactly what they're thinking. I know what they're thinking. When something happens, I think, okay, they're going to do this, this, and this. And invariably, that's what they're doing because they're using the same playbook that the same people in their positions used throughout the entire Obama administration. There's nothing new happening here. And they don't realize that this whole cabal, they don't realize that other countries are watching this who know far more than I do. And they're saying, well, this is what these people will do if we do this. And so essentially, these bad actors around the world can do whatever they want because they know exactly what the US response is going to be. There's zero strategic ambiguity. Whereas with Donald Trump, as you say, they see him as maybe a little bit of a wild card. And there is absolutely strategic ambiguity because they don't know what he's going to do. And I suspect part of that is because Donald Trump's not entirely sure what he's going to do either.
On the other hand,
to do it.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think you've got something like the relationship between Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, he's very, these are two leaders who have worked together. I think they have similar desires for an end product.
Yes.
And I think, Trump is willing to play ball with the Israelis.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are hoping that once Donald Trump gets into office, things will essentially be on a factory reset. Now, I've been following the preliminary peace talk news that's come out, and obviously I only get the news that's actually released. I don't have any inside stretch on this, but I do understand how to analyze the news. And what it seems to me is that Volodymyr Zelensky, he's getting ready to accept that there has to be an end date to hostilities and that Vladimir Putin will keep the territory that he currently holds. And there'll be negotiations to try and get some back, but there'll be diplomatic ones rather than doing a fighting force. But at the moment, you still have the US pushing Ukraine to lower the draft to age 18, which means that, and the reason they'd have to do that is because they've lost all of their other people. This is a country that doesn't have people left. And
well, let me just say Russia's lost a few too.
Russia's got the people to lose. I mean, historically, they don't mind throwing 500,000 bodies at a conquest. They don't mind them. Whereas Ukraine doesn't have it, especially younger people, because of course they were under a lot of regime pressure 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And so they didn't have a big boom in population. So they already had a low population and they're losing them. They're either injured, they're damaged psychologically, or they're running away. And so now they're looking to sacrifice the future to win today. So Zelensky, he wants to finish. I'm absolutely positive. He wants the war to finish, but he just needs the go-ahead from all of his strategic partners. Because if they just pull everything, well, then Vladimir Putin can just waltz wherever he wants to go. But the cost there is that until they say this is the deadline for when we stop hostilities, Vladimir Putin is going to, because he knows this is coming down the pipeline as well, he's going to be pushing his troops to take as much territory as they can until that end date. And when that end date strikes, they're right, this is the territory we've got. We're not pushing any further. That's the deal. But until that happens, until that end date,
keep pushing, yeah.
He'll keep pushing and he'll be more aggressive and more people on both sides will lose their lives. Homes will be destroyed. Innocents caught in crossfire until they come to that. Now, Donald Trump, I think it's pretty clear that that's the angle that he wants to take. Joe Biden still seems to be pushing this in his waning days as the lamest of lame duck presidents, seems to be pushing, well, you got to keep fighting this war. And all that's going to mean is that Ukraine loses more territory and more lives. And it seems a very sad state of affairs, Lisa.
Yeah, and it is worrisome. I mean, I think Americans, the foreign conflicts on the front burner, but, they're still there. And in the last week, we've been facing what's going on in Syria and the Assad regime going down. And, historically in the Middle East, when a regime goes down, something that replaces it is worse.
It's a gradually worsening whack-a-mole contest out there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So the guy who is taking over, I forget his name just now, up until 5 minutes ago, or 2016, if you believe the press, was a terrorist. His group is still on many terrorist watch lists. And we expect that this is going to be a new peaceful, inclusive regime in Syria. I think they're going to play it quiet and play all the right notes of the peace until the money starts flowing in from the U.S. taxpayer, obviously, because it's always the U.S. taxpayer on the hook. And then they'll go back to whatever it is they want to do. They'll continue with trying to essentially rebuild up a caliphate because they're caliphate oriented. That's what this group is. And I just hope that under Joe Biden, he doesn't commit too much to what's happening in Syria, because as soon as I'll just go out on a limb here, as soon as the inevitable executions start, because
that's the way it's done over there. Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as those start, nobody wants Joe Biden to be tied to, but you supported these people. And I think it's a foolhardy move to try and claim some credit for the deposing of al-Assad when you don't know what you're going to get in return.
But the problem with this is that over the last 4 years, we started with Ukraine, then we moved to the famous October Hamas. Now we're into Assad. It's like counting down the days, and Donald Trump is issuing edicts already. He's not even president, and saying, we want our hostages back or else.
That's I found that statement very, very interesting because he said there'll be hell to pay. He didn't say who the hell was going to be paid by. And I suspect, and this wasn't my own original thought, this was prompted by...
Let the Israelis do it.
Well, the Dave Patterson, our national security correspondent, who really just understands so much about all this stuff, he put that into my head that maybe it's Iran that Donald Trump is talking about. When he says there'll be hell to pay, I think he's talking about Iran. And Joe Biden's just unblocked another bundle of cash from what I'm reading today. Another big bundle of cash has been unblocked for the Iranians, and I think that's who Donald Trump is talking about when he says there'll be hell to pay.
Well, there's no doubt that world peace is on many people's list for Christmas this year. What about your list? And there's nothing perhaps better at Christmas than having a toddler around. And you have one. So tell us about the Christmas plans at Mark Angelides' home.
We shall be having a little Christmas tree. We bought a small Christmas tree when he was born, and we're going to hopefully have it continue to grow as he grows, if we can keep it alive. The tree I'm talking about, of course. And we should be being thankful that, and this household will be focusing on being thankful for the things we have. Lisa K. Donna, I'm thankful for you too. Thanks for being here.
Merry Christmas, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our very special guest, Lisa K. Donner, and of course, extend my thanks, my New Year's wishes, and my Merry Christmases to you, the listeners at home, for joining us. And please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.